Hi, this is Dan Korver, pastor here at Dalton Hill Baptist Church. We're a small Baptist church located in Owasso, Oklahoma. We're small enough to know you, but we're big enough to serve you and for you to serve as well. Our vision is to rescue, restore, and return to service. Rescue a non-believer or a believer who has been hurt or is lost, restoring them to Christ in fellowship with other believers with the desire that they in turn will help others along their way.
We've been doing the heroes and villains, and we also kind of switched to doing some of the miracles. These will be a little different miracle today, or miracles, but nevertheless, they're still miracles. I was reading this past week about a lot of golf terms. Some of them I knew, some I'd never heard of in my life. You know, I've heard of, the birdie, 1 under, a bogey, 1 over, par would be, ace would be hole in one. 4, that's what I have to holler whenever I play. It means, you're safe if you're on the green if I play, as long as you're on the green I'm supposed to go to. But they had others. Snowman. I thought, what? Or how about a banana? I hadn't heard of that one. Sandbagger. Okay, now what's sandbagging, Charlie?
Sandbagging is when you come out of your hand.
Okay, you're a better player than you say you are, and you're trying to basically get an advantage. Yes. Yeah. There are others. Okay, there's another one called a breakfast shot. What's a breakfast shot? Okay, breakfast would be, you would come to it, there's 4 of you playing or however many, and you're out there playing or going to play, and you get there and you're running late, nobody gets to practice, and you get on the first shot, first person, and they have a terrible shot. And they call it a breakfast shot, meaning, I want to do it again. Yes, that's coming. Okay, what about a concession putt? Anybody know the origin of concession putt? Okay, that started, one of the most famous was 1969, the Ryder Cup. Ryder, remember, you have the best Americans playing against the best in Europe. Came down to the last hole, 18th hole. Jack Nicklaus got his birdie from 10 feet out. The person he was playing against was having a phenomenal year, and a young man by the name of Tony Jacklin. Jacklin's was 3 feet away. If he makes it, they are even, and the tournament ends, and they tied. What would you do? Jack Nicklaus walked up and grabbed it. Jack Nicklaus walked up and grabbed it after he did it, picked it up and conceded. You're going to make that one. We tied. And they said it's the greatest act of sportsmanship that you see. And even today, they still talk about the great act of sportsmanship that he did as the best player at that particular time of the game to the young man. Concession. You stop and you think about it, they later, by the way, they formed quite a friendship, and they later did a golf course design together called the Concession Golf Course in Florida. So here they're opposing because of that one act. Okay, like they just talked about, according to legend, that David B. Mulligan was a golfer actually originally from Canada, I believe, and then came to the U.S. He had a terrible shot. So he told his playing partners, I'm going to have a correction shot. I want to do it over. And those who are playing with him started calling it, no, that's a mulligan shot. So today, it's still called a mulligan if you have a bad one. You can't do it in competitive golf, but you have a bad shot, you may, a mulligan, I want to do it again. And according, you have to have playing people that are in agreement with it. But a mulligan. So I want you to think about that. We're not talking about golf so much today, but how does this need a mulligan in our Christian life? So let's think about it. A mulligan is granted. Look over, and we'll look at some different ones. Look over in Luke chapter 5. If you notice in verse 1, We're at the Sea of Galilee. Penzance had two different names there, and you'll see the other here that we have. And the multitudes there. And if you remember in John 1, they had started following him part-time, but now it's going to change. But you notice in verse 2 of chapter 5, and he saw two boats, Jesus speaking, lying at the edge of the lake. The fishermen had gotten out of them and were washing their nets. And he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little way from land. And he sat down and began teaching the multitude from the boat. Now, why would he go out in the boat? What does your voice do across water? It amplifies. So he's going out, he's going away from the people, but it's actually going to allow his voice to carry better. Okay, so this is kind of a little bit of the setting. Notice then what happens then. And when he finished, he said to Simon, "Put out in the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we worked hard all night, caught nothing. But at your bidding, I will let down the nets." Now, those of you that fish much, normally fish are going to come in at night to shallower water where it's cooler. And in the heat of the day, they go to deeper water. They also, the predators will use darkness with which to come in to get their prey at night. They can't see them. So being fishermen, fish are going to have left. It's hot heat of the day, they would have left. Why? Lord, you're telling me to do something that goes against all my training and what I know. What would you do? And I think, first of all, when you think about it, is stepping out in faith is the first point. That you notice, I think we have to release our past experience and knowledge. Think about it. What about with Jericho? That makes a lot of sense. We're going to go capture Jericho. We're going to start with one of the more powerful cities, and we're going to march around it and go home. Every day. I mean, that really sounds like a good military strategy. You think about it. But I think it's interesting. We have to, first of all, we have to relinquish our past experience and knowledge. The older we get, I think the harder that sometimes becomes. But notice he says, "At your bidding, I'll do it." How many of us will respond in obedience to his directives, even if it goes against what you think? Isn't that what Proverbs 3 says? Trust in the Lord what?
All your heart.
All your heart? On my what?
Your phone.
Well, as a fisherman, that doesn't make any sense. That won't work. We've done it all day. They're not there. We'll come back tomorrow. No? All right. If that's what you tell me to do. Notice, I think you go on, then obviously they had this great catch, and the quantity was so great, they had to get the other boat to come over. So you'd have Peter, James, and John, and Andrew. And it started filling up, so much so that the boat starts to sink. Now, I've heard of fish stories, but I've never had to go where you can fill up two boats and they start sinking. Obviously the Lord's doing that too, to show what? It wasn't just one fish. It's to show he is in charge, he knows, and you trust him. I think it's interesting to realize the possibilities. Notice what happens in, they're amazed in verse 10. And so also James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were his partners with Simon. Jesus said to Simon, "Do not fear, from now on you'll be catching men." I think it's important to recognize God's plan. And from this point on, they started following Jesus full time. It was part-time before, now it's full-time. But they had to step out in faith. Because it doesn't make sense to do what Jesus told them to do. But with him, all things are possible. So I want you to think about the question, is Jesus asking you to do something a different way? I've always done it that way. And how of us are getting creatures of habit, and the longer we've done it, it's the only way to do it, right? How obedient am I to his commands, even if they don't make sense? Have you ever been asked to do something when it doesn't make sense? Nobody? Have I failed in the past because I did it my way in my own strength? Now, there's nothing wrong with them going fishing, but obviously they tried everything they could their way, and they obviously, that's how they made a living. They knew what they were doing, but it didn't work. Now, think about it. So, stepping out in faith. How many of us need to step out in faith? Now, this would be unusual. Yesterday, I was telling Mike a little bit about it. I had a big tree go down our yard, and so I've been cutting it up. And 5 trips so far to the landfill. I got 1 to go. I get there yesterday morning, and I'm starting unloading to get it all unloaded. And of course, with all the stuff we've had, and on a Saturday, the place, I mean, there is vehicles everywhere. There's 20-something in line wanting my place and all this. I go to get in the car to drive off with the trailer. No keys in my pocket. There's no keys in the car. Gene is at work. They have the big bucket trucks, moving all this. What are you going to do? When all else fails, what? So I'm looking everywhere. I can't find anything. And so I have to unload everything that's in the pile before the guy scrapes it off, and pulling off every branch everywhere, I looked under the vehicle, looked everywhere. The very last one I go to pick up, there are the keys.
You always find it in the last place to look.
I'm glad I found them. And I thought, Gene is late for work, it's a bad day. I can't imagine what's going to happen if I call her and say, leave work, go home, get the keys, bring them here. But again, how many of us really believe that prayer works? You step out in faith and you pray. Because obviously trying to find something in the middle of all that would be very, very difficult normally to find. Let's go over to John 21, another fishing story. Obviously, if you're dealing with the disciples, you often have fishing stories. So the first one is we have to step out in faith. The second one, relating to the Mulligan, would be starting again. If you remember the setting that you have in Mark 14 and verse 50, you remember Peter said, everybody can deny you and leave, but I what? I won't. Also it says all of them said the same thing. But in Mark 14 and verse 50, how many of them left? All of them left. It wasn't just Peter. All of them left. So that you get that as the background. You notice then in verse 21, you kind of get the setting. And these things Jesus manifested. Now remember, earlier in chapter 20, he first comes to the disciples without Thomas, then he comes with Thomas. So this is the third time he's at the sea. And notice in verse 2, they were together, Simon Peter, Thomas, called Didymus, meaning twin, Nathanael of Cana of Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, and 2 other disciples. You ever wonder who the other 2 are? There are 7 of them. 7 of the 11 are here. I would propose it's probably Andrew and it's probably Philip, because they're from the same city, you remember, and they're fishermen. But we don't know that. Notice Simon, being the leader, says, "What? I'm going fishing." Why would he be going fishing?
Back to their former job.
Possibly back to their former job. Going back. Don't know for sure. Notice they said, "We're going to go with you." Notice then they went out and got in the boat. That night they caught nothing. Sounds familiar to Luke 5? Going out all night. When day was breaking, Jesus stood at the beach. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus therefore said, verse 5, "Children," or lads, "you don't have any fish, do you?" How do you know that? They said, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat and you'll have a catch." And what would you say?
Yeah.
Remember, they don't know it's Jesus. And what would you and I say on anything that we're doing? I'm the fisherman. I've been out there, and I've been on both sides of the boat casting. I don't just cast on one side. and you're telling me to go over here, and it's getting warming up, the fish are no longer in the shallow water, they moved out. Notice then what happens. They cast therefore that they were not able to haul it in because of the great number. The disciple, John, whom Jesus loved, said to Peter, "It's the Lord." So when Simon Peter heard it, that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. The other disciples came in a little boat, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards away, dragging the net full of fish. So when they got out upon the land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid, and fish placed on it and bread. Now where did Jesus get the fish? Did he have a fishing pole? You ever wonder where he got this fish? Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish which you have now caught." Simon Peter went up and drew a net to the land full of large fish, 153. Now why would they know the number? If you're fishing and you're partners and you fish and you have 7 of them, you're going to do what with the fish?
Divide them.
Divide them up. That's roughly 22 apiece. When you go in fishing tournaments, you only count the 5 largest ones. I have never gone fishing and caught 22 fish in a day. I'm lucky to catch 1. You think about it. Obviously, John wants us to know these aren't just little ones, these are keepers. And there's 153 of them. A total miracle. I think it's interesting when you start looking at some of it. Notice starting in, so they obviously they eat with him. So notice in 14 is the 3rd time he's manifested. We saw the first 2 in chapter 20. And then notice then, how many people are present? How many disciples? 7. He now asks Peter the question, "Do you love me? Tend my sheep." But how many of them heard that? All of them. Peter is the spokesman, and obviously he denied him 3 times, but don't you think that also applies to the other ones as well? Because obviously when he talks about his death, John, he then turns and says, "What about John?" And so all of them could hear this. And that's why I call it a mulligan. Renew your calling. Tend my sheep. Yes, you've forsaken me. Yes, you all ran. But if you'll do what I tell you to do, isn't that what he says to do in chapter 20? Follow me, by the way, 21. So think about it, starting again, do we recognize our limitations? Do we respond in obedience? Renew our calling. So some questions. Have I blown it? And think all is lost in my service for him? If that was the case, how many of us would even be able to do anything today? And what happens is that we want the Lord to forgive us and use us, but are we doing the same courtesy for other people? Notice, I think it's interesting. How many of us need a mulligan today in a service for the Lord? Second one, would I cast again after failing all night? Most of us wouldn't do it. We just quit. I was about there yesterday, but I still wasn't to the bottom of the pile. I wasn't sure what I was going to do when I got there, but anyway. Do I respond to his directives in faith or through my senses and experience? Give you an example. Brian will know the answer to this one. But if you work much on equipment, what's the little saying when you can take something off or put it on? Righty, tighty, lefty. What happens if you're working on an old Dodge pickup, Brian?
You're on the left side.
Depends if you're on the left side or the right side. When they built them, they thought you always, when you're going forward, you want the bolts to tighten. So one side you go right, you will loosen clockwise. The other side you loosen counterclockwise. With the air tools of today, what's going to happen? You're going to break them off. But that's the knowledge you're taught. I also had lawn equipment, one particular engine, the bolt underneath of the carburetor was a left-handed thread. If you went the wrong way, you just ruined the carburetor. But everywhere you go, it's always, that's how you take things off. But that's not always the way it is. So you stop and you think about it. I think it's interesting. Do I respond to his directives even if it goes against everything that I've been taught? The last one I think is interesting. Again, this will be going back to the Old Testament. We know the story well. So we're going to start off stepping out in faith on a Mulligan. Second one, starting again under his directive. The third thing is in Joshua chapter 7 and chapter 8. We know the story real well. If you remember this in the setting, if you remember they crossed the Jordan River and the water parted when? When they put their feet in the water. You also remember just before they went to Ai, you remember to Jericho, you remember that the night before, Joshua was out and he sees the captain of the Lord's army. And realizing that I'm not leading it, the captain's leading it. Important to remember. They also then had the great victory at Jericho. So you think about the setting. We've crossed the Jordan River, miracle. We have the captain leading us, miracle. We just conquered a mighty city, miracle. And now you come up to Ai. Seeing our sin and our limitations, I think it's important. If you look in chapter 7, notice what it says in verse 1. But the sons of Israel acted unfaithfully in regarding to the things under the ban. For Achan, the son of Carmi, you notice what it says. He took some of the things he was told not to, and he hid them. So there's sin in the camp. Now notice that the rest of the people don't know there's sin. His family does, but Joshua doesn't, and the rest of the people don't. But the importance of sin in the camp. But notice the other thing that's a problem is notice what happens when you get down to verse 2 to verse 4. Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near, go up and spy out the land. So the men went up and spied out Ai. Now think about this. If you were in the audience, and you and I do the same thing a lot, they turned to Joshua, verse 3, and said, don't let all the people go up. Only about 2,000 or 3,000 men need to go up yet. Do not make all the people toil up there. There are few. Is that God's plan? Hey, a little bitty city, we don't need everybody. We can handle this. We just need 2,000 or 3,000. We'll wipe them out. How many of us have ever done that? Get overconfident, not relying on the Lord, and go out on. By the way, Joshua didn't go up either, by the way. Did you notice that? He didn't go. He didn't lead the people, nor did they ask God. How many of us make decisions by not asking the Lord first? We can handle it. We don't need it. And so notice that's what's happening here. They have sin in the camp, needs cleansing. They need to rely on Him, and we realize too that our sin can affect other people in the group. For all of us. And it's just some little white one, doesn't matter, but it does. Notice what happens then. They obviously cleanse they recognize it and they cleanse it. And then you'll notice the success. The success happens when they confess the sin, acknowledge it, and direct it. And the second thing in chapter 8, they now follow God's plan. They break up into 3 groups and they basically have a false attack, and then they run like they did before and they have an ambush. Well, notice, totally different tactic. Jericho, they did what?
Walked around.
Now this, they're looking more of a natural military strategy. And they're going to basically believe that Ai is overly confident, and they're going to see you run. We're going to go up there a little bit. As soon as they come out, we're going to run. They're going to think we're doing like last time, and they're going to leave the city unprotected. Notice that was God's plan. 1 minute the plan makes sense. In another minute, marching around the city makes no sense. But when it's God's plan, it works, irregardless. So think about it. When you come down to the Mulligan, before you give a Mulligan opportunity, do I need to confess something first? They had to come to failure and recognize, is there something I'm doing that I need to correct, or we're doing, and we need to address it. The second thing, do I realize that my sin affects other people? Our sin affects so many people. So many people. And I think it's important to recognize that. Do I rely on my own strength and abilities, or do I follow His plan? It's interesting, if you're looking at military strategy, the way they conquered the land was not a good military strategy. You don't start with a strong city like Jericho. You don't go into the middle. If you go into the middle, you got enemies on what sides? North and south. But that's what God told them to do. So I want you to think about it. If we're stepping out in faith, am I obedient to His commands even when it doesn't make sense? And I think it's interesting when you do that. When we start again, recognize our mistakes, but will I cast again even when it doesn't make sense? And seeing my sin and limitations, the older you get, I think the more easier it is to see our limitations. But why is that beneficial?
Rely more on the Lord.
You rely more on the Lord. Why have we fallen so many times then we quit? Because we relied on ourselves so many times. Now He has us where He wants us. You cast where He tells you to cast, whether it makes sense or doesn't make sense. You look at the disciples that they chose. How many of you would have chosen the disciples? Would you have chosen fishermen? Did they change the world? Would you have chosen a Paul? You think about it. No. Never would have. But with God's grace, our job, just like baking the cake, is what? To be obedient and give out the Word of God, invite people into our home, share it, and it's the Holy Spirit that does the other with the Word of God. So if you need a mulligan, why don't you ask Him for one?
We'd love for you to come and visit with us and fellowship with us. We're located at 8263 North Owasso Expressway, which is on the east side of Highway 169 North, between 76th and 86th Street North. We have coffee and fellowship from 8:30 to 9 Sundays, followed by Sunday school for all ages from 9 to 9:45, and our Sunday morning worship service is from 10 to 11. We likewise have a Wednesday night service for all ages from 7 to 8. Now may the Lord of peace Himself give you peace at all times, and in every way the Lord be with you all the time.